a rock, paper, scissors, shoot on who gets to hold the baby later. Oh, I'm sorry, pastors, calling dibs. We're going to continue our Jesus in Poverty study today by first reading the scripture. Our reading is from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 26, verse 1 through 16. And there is an insert in your folders from last week, if you want to follow along. Hear now the word of God. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." Now Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. A woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum, and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. This is the word of God.
Thanks be to God.
Jennifer. Welcome, everybody. This is now the second Sunday of our Lenten series where we're talking about Jesus and poverty. So there's a lot in this passage. It's very rich. There are two things that I want to highlight before we go to the next move from here. So the first thing is, in this story, who does Jesus identify with? The poor. Who does Jesus identify with? The poor. Jesus identifies himself as a poor person. Okay, clear? We're there? Okay, good. I think that's important. The second point I want to raise is, who is it who is being judged? What was that? Say louder. What does it say in the text?
Not just the rich.
It's everybody.
What does it say? What does it say? Look in your, look.
The goats.
Give me a word. Give me a word.
The people that do not do unto the poor.
Let's try verse 32.
All the nations.
All the nations. I think we have a tendency, especially in 21st century America, we're a very independent, personal-focused society. The Bible was not written in a culture like that at all. It was communal. So we tend to say, oh, the rich people, or people who don't do this thing, but it's actually the nations who are being judged communally for not doing this work, right? Sometimes we read this passage and we think, oh, I didn't do this thing myself, but really it's about what our society does as a whole, what our culture does. Different way to think about that. And that reminds me of Martin Luther King talking in 1967 when he said, we're called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? So, why are people poor in the time of Jesus? Anybody? Any ideas?
Lepers?
Lepers. lepers? Why say more? Why would lepers have been poor?
Because they've been cast out from the community and they're shunned. They can't probably hold a job.
Yep, so people who had a skin disease that was seen as unclean were not highly employable. It was even a kind of a political tactic at the time to spread the rumor that someone had leprosy, even if they didn't, as a way to kind of get their stuff and their privilege away from them. That's great.
What about widows?
Widows, yeah, so we have a society that's based on a patriarchal structure, right, where a father or a husband is the one who takes care of women. If you're a widow and you've lost that, you don't have access, right? You can't make money yourself, you can't own your own property. Great.
Strangers.
Strangers. There's a lot in the Bible about like foreign people who come around and like how do they fit into the community? Is that what you?
Like, those are the people that they will be cast out.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, it was connecting it with the inside and outside.
Oh, yeah, totally. So people who don't belong in our society, right? Right. Yep. What were you saying, Steph?
Caste system.
A kind of a caste system. So some people
Just
Had-
by birth.
had more power, privilege, money
Or
than
not.
others.
I would think it's the same thing, kind of like it is today, a feudal system. That's how the rich get richer and back to the poor.
Yeah, so what we remember is that we think about Judea or Israel as its own little thing, right? It has these rules in the Bible that ordain how it should live, and it just should be its own thing. But at the time of Jesus, it's been occupied, it's been taken over by Rome. And so there's a biblical social historian, his name is Richard Horsley, and he says, the fundamental conflict evident in ancient Jewish literature was not between Jews and Greeks, or Jews and Romans, or Jews and Christians. Rather, the fundamental conflict was between the Roman, Herodian, and high priestly rulers on the one hand, and the Judean and Galilean villagers, whose produce supplied tribute to Caesar, taxes for Herod, and tithes and offering for the priest and temple apparatus on the other. So, when Rome occupies a foreign country, have you heard this term Pax Romana? The peace of Rome. But they were very proud of it, right? It means everything's going to be calm, there's not going to be fighting, there's an idea that there will be basic needs supplied for. What it also meant was that soldiers, people would be conscripted as soldiers into the Roman army, and that taxes would be taken on people's land. Now, in Judea and Israel, it's a very fertile kind of agricultural place, right? And people have land, that's their family's land, they've been farming for generations. And it was a lot of subsistence farming, right? Where you and your family group kind of did your thing, you would trade, maybe yourself some things. But we get this empire coming in who wants taxes. They're asking for a third of everything that you grow or more. And if you can't pay, people were forced to take out loans from the wealthy elite. So we talked about, Richard Horsley talks about the temple priests being part of this system. They received tithes and taxes. That's where the bank was. And that's why there was some distrust among these common people for the temple priests, because they were kind of seen to be in bed with Rome. So what do you do if you can't pay your taxes in the time of Jesus? Go to jail? Yep. If you want to avoid going to jail, what could you do? What, back there, what was it?
They would take the land.
Yep, they would take your land. That's absolutely right. Sometimes you could be hired back to work on the land that had been taken. Sometimes you could make a deal with a rich person. You could sell your work or your land to them. And what you get is the amassing by the richest people of all of the land and all of the produce of the land. And then you get this kind of lower class created that's doing the low wage labor, right? That's struggling to work the land. Instead of being a fisherman who has your own net and your own boat and your own business, you become someone who's paid very little to fish as part of a huge fishing kind of business that ships all over the empire.
Wow, so much has changed, hasn't it?
So when Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer forgive us our debts. It's a pretty big deal to the people that he's talking to. We think about Jesus as being like us, right? That's just kind of our go-to, because we know what life is like for us, and so it's easy to imagine that. Liz P. Harris in this book, she says, if we are tempted to describe Jesus as a literate middle-class carpenter, cross-cultural anthropology reminds us there was no middle class in ancient societies, and that peasants are usually illiterate. How could Jesus have become what never existed at his time? Interesting. Yeah. So, Jesus existed in this system that made people poor. And people who were poor easily got poorer. Clear? Understand? Does that make sense to you? It sounds familiar in some ways. So again, Martin Luther King, charity is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It's realizing that the edifice that produces beggars needs to be restructured. So, how does poverty work? Why are people poor in our time? And I would love to show you guys a little video clip. Scott Dickinson, can you show this? You might have to put your password in there, which none of us will ever do. This video is from a PBS series called Race, The Power of an Illusion. It was made in the 90s. If you ever get a chance to watch it, please do. It's amazing. But I just thought since we've already done all this work about race and difference and reconciliation, this might be a helpful point for us to think about wealth and poverty as well. We looked last week at this poverty statistics sheet, and one of the things I think Stephanie mentioned this was about children in poverty. Almost half of all children are poor or low income, but that includes 9 out of 10 African American children. And when you ask why something like this happens, I feel like the answers that we reach for in America most easily are, people are lazy, single mothers, right? We go right to the individual. We don't think at all about the structures in our society that produce inequality. I know for my husband's family, for example, his grandparents both owned homes. Both grandfathers had been in the war, who benefited from the GI Bill. When my husband's parents bought their house, they gave them money to put into it, and now that we are starting out in our life, my in-laws would like to give us money just to get our house started, and that's because of that kind of advantage. It's not true on my side of the family, certainly, because there are a lot of other things going on. It's not always true for all of us. But when we see how those systems start to play out, it's things that we think we pretend it's an accident, or we pretend that it just happens and we're not responsible or we can't do anything. These things are not accidents. So, any other thoughts? Do you want to talk for a minute at your tables about your impression of this video, of thinking about the nations being judged in Matthew 25, and if that's changing anything for you, or if you have any questions or thoughts about poverty because of it? You want to discuss at tables? We can take the last 5 minutes. Cool, I see some nodding. All right, thank you.